Can you believe it's been 3 years since I launched the Content 10x podcast? In this episode, I share my content journey from zero to author, speaker, and recognized thought leader. How did this happen? Listen in to find out.
Welcome to the Content 10x podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and this week's episode marks 3 years of the podcast. Well, I can't quite believe it's been 3 years. It's just crazy. So firstly, I want to thank every single person who listens into the show. Whether you've been here from the start, which would just be incredible, or whether this is your first episode and you're dipping your toe in, or rather your ear in to see what it's all about, just thank you so much for tuning in. Now, I thought it would be a good idea in this episode to share with you my content journey. I kind of hesitated on doing this because I don't want it to seem really self-indulgent, but I think it's a really interesting journey to share with you, so I decided that I think people would like to hear it. I can't quite believe that I've been hosting the Content 10x podcast for 3 years, putting out a weekly episode every single week since October 2017. So I want to explain to you what creating content has done for me and my business. Now, when I first started Content 10x, which is a highly specialised content repurposing creative agency, we were and still are providing a service to video creators and podcasters. Now, without question, I knew that I wanted to start creating weekly episodic content, not only because I believed in the power of content, which is obvious since I'm in the business of content, but also because I wanted to practice what we preach. That was really important to me. After all, if content can help you to become recognised as a thought leader and help grow your business and personal brand, then let me show you starting from scratch. So I was trying to decide what content to create, deciding between video content and podcast. And with some support and encouragement from my good friend and mentor, Chris Ducker, I decided to launch a podcast. I wanted to deeply understand what it's like to be a podcaster, because a lot of our first clients coming in were podcasters. And in all honesty as well, I love the idea of a podcast versus video, because I think I was lacking confidence with going on camera, and talking into a mic just seemed a lot easier and safer to start my content journey with. So the podcast launched and I was putting out weekly content about content repurposing. Now, a few of my top tips here are, firstly, to be consistent with your message and ensure that if you want your expertise in a particular area to stand out, then create content about that area. Don't become really general. So I was acutely aware there were lots of marketing shows and shows about business and content, but no shows about repurposing content, and that was my thing. And I made sure every single episode was about content repurposing. Next, be patient. You have got to be patient and accept that content is a long game. Also, repurpose your content. I know this sounds really obvious coming from me, but you have to find ways to maximize the time that you spend creating content and repurpose it for other platforms, audiences, and users. So from day one, the Content 10x podcast has been treated like a client at Content 10x. We put it through a repurposing service every single week, just like we do with our clients' content. So the podcast episodes get repurposed into a blog post and social media content and email, video content, and often other content too, like infographics and content upgrades depending on the topic. Okay, so over time, as I was creating weekly content and repurposing and getting myself and my message out there every week, and on some platforms every day due to the repurposing, things started to happen and I started to get noticed. So firstly, I started to get invited as a guest on other people's podcasts. I started to get recognised as an expert on the topic of repurposing, and people wanted to interview me. And this was fantastic. I was developing relationships with people through going on their podcasts, and I was getting in front of completely new and different audiences. Now, the first ever podcast interview that I did was for Janet Murray's podcast, which is a hugely popular show, and I've since been on Janet's show a few times and she's been on mine too, and we've become really good friends. And this really reminds me to point out that inviting guests onto my show from time to time also helped me to build new relationships and opportunities which have arisen just from those those conversations that I had with my guests. So a side benefit of having a podcast or video show can often be the door that it opens to people who you can build relationships with. I've developed so many relationships due to my content. It's not about the downloads or subscriber numbers all the time, far, far from it. It can be about the relationships. So I started to get invited onto podcasts and onto Facebook Lives and LinkedIn Lives and being interviewed for people's membership sites and their webinars and all sorts of things like that. And this was all thanks to the content that I was putting out. Now, as I mentioned before, I had my weekly podcast, which got turned into a weekly blog post, and also lots of social content. The blog posts were always written for SEO and meant that the website was constantly being updated with great content. And this was starting to help us get found by search engines as well. So the social media content was helping to gain attention and engagement on platforms, and the blog content helping us to get found through search.
Hey, just a little break from this podcast episode to ask you a question. Would you like one single place that you can go to that provides you with everything you need to be able to implement the best practices in content repurposing for your video content, your podcast episodes, and your social media content today? To help you get more value from the content that you create, get more time back, and help you reach more people than you ever thought possible. If so, then you are going to love the Content 10x Toolkit. The toolkit is full of video tutorials, templates, checklists, swipe files, step-by-step guides and more that shows you how to repurpose your content in the best ways possible today. No more Googling, no more figuring it out yourself. We provide you with everything that you need to become a content repurposing pro. If this sounds like something that would interest you, then go check out the Content 10x Toolkit at content10x.com/toolkit. Okay, and back to this week's episode.
So I then branched out into speaking. So I decided to take my message and my content to the stage. And I landed my first speaking opportunity, speaking as the founder of Content 10x at Podcast Movement in 2018 in Philadelphia. Now, this was August 2018, so the podcast wasn't even one by then. So this first speaking gig that I landed at Podcast Movement in 2018 was a really fun talk called an Ignite talk, where the slides changed every 15 seconds. And we created these really awesome slides that we then repurposed into a comic book. It sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Check out episode 68 of the Content 10x podcast to find out more about how we did that. But then this comic book became the handout for when I went on to deliver other talks. That was some really awesome repurposing that we did there. And then other speaking opportunities came along. So I had the opportunity to speak again at Podcast Movement in 2019 and also at Podfest in 2019, which is another big podcasting event. I also spoke at Janet Murray's Content Live event, Agency Transformation Live, which was a great event run by Lee Jackson for agency owners. And I spoke at Retain Live for membership site owners, put on by my good friends Mike Morrison and Callie Willows, aka the Membership Guys. And this all led up to me speaking at a Youpreneur Summit in 2019 put on by Chris Ducker. This is such a wonderful event. It's an annual event, unfortunately not in 2020, but it's the event for entrepreneurs building a business based on their expertise. And it really was a highlight of my career to speak at Youpreneur Summit, especially due to my journey of being an attendee the first year. And then I was an expert speaker on a panel in 2018 and then a main speaker in 2019. And certainly not to overlook that I spoke on that panel in 2018 as well. Content 10x was only a year and a half in, and I was invited on an expert panel then and then a main speaker in 2019. So as you can see, if I hadn't been putting out regular content and repurposing it to achieve its maximum potential every week, I don't think I'd have been speaking on all of these stages. I'd not have been recognised as the authority, and I'd not have built relationships based off this too. So it was another huge career highlight for me, and my book took well over a year to write, but it would have taken so much longer if I didn't start from a point of having over a year's worth of content. So do check out episode 93 of the podcast to find out more about repurposing content into a book. But having lots of content, having repurposed my podcast episodes into blog posts, definitely were essential steps towards me becoming an author. And also, being a content creator, both a writer and podcaster, meant I was able to hone those skills to write my book and record the audiobook as well. So publishing my book opened up yet more opportunities, more speaking requests, more opportunities to guest on other podcasts and shows, and so on. Now, I also mentioned earlier that throughout this whole content journey, we've been putting lots and lots of content onto our website. So repurposing podcast episodes into SEO-focused blog posts. And that too has paid off, but it takes time. So we are number one on Google, at least now when I'm speaking, for content repurposing service and content repurposing expert. And it's taken a long time to get there. So my key point there, content is a long game, but it is worth it. I wouldn't have gone from aspiring podcaster to speaker to author to being a global recognized leader if I'd not created and repurposed content. Now, from a business perspective, it's great because prospects come to you more. And also when you speak into people, your expertise and credibility is not in question. So I truly believe that if I'd not put myself out there across different content formats and platforms, none of this would have happened. So I really hope that by sharing my journey, I've inspired you to create content and provided you with lots of useful tips. Thank you so much for listening to today. I really appreciate it. If you could leave a review, it'd make my podcast's 3rd birthday. And if you'd like any help with your content repurposing, then we provide an end-to-end content repurposing service for video creators and podcasters. Whether you're already creating video content or already have a podcast or looking to launch something new, we take care of everything. So please do get in touch. And also please do follow me on social media. I'm at Content10X on all the platforms, and just look for Amy Woods, Content 10X founder, on LinkedIn. So all that's left to say is thank you again so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.